Hello and welcome to Children's Church. Sometimes things are happening and we don't understand why. We can be right in the middle of a really important time and completely miss it. You ever had that happen to you where you just don't understand something really important is happening until all of a sudden it's like, oh, wait a minute, this is a big deal. Did you know it's like that pretty much throughout all of history? Things didn't feel historic in the middle of the moment until afterwards when we look back and go, wow, that was a really big deal. And sometimes people can be right in the middle of those circumstances and just have no clue what's actually going on around them. Our story this week is, well, sort of a time just like that. See, Jesus and his disciples have been walking from Judea and trying to get down to Galilee, and they did something unusual. All the other times, any other good Jewish person would go around Samaria, which is a longer walk, but it kept you from going through the dirty Samaritan villages. Jesus didn't do that. Right through Samaria he goes. And his disciples followed him. After all, he's the master, but okay. And as they're going along, it was really hot out. And it's in the heat in the middle of the day, and Jesus was just tired. He was worn out. And they got to this well near the city of Sychar, and this well had been dug hundreds of years before by none other than Jacob himself. And Jesus just stops by the well and he sits down. He can't go any further. And his disciples said, you know what, you just stay right here. We're going to go into town and get some food. They thought Jesus was just tired and they were going to be nice. They had no idea what was just about to happen. Jesus wasn't so much tired as much as he was waiting. See, there at the well, every morning in the early part of the day, all the women of the town would bring out their big jars and collect all the water, and then they'd go back to their home and do all their chores. Nobody would go out in the hottest part of the day to do hard work. That's just not a good idea. And so while Jesus is waiting at the well, along comes this woman with her water jar in the heat of the day. Now, it's not because she forgot to go out in the morning. No. And it's not because she ran out of water, well, though she had. She was trying to go when no one else would be there. And she had a reason. But I'm getting ahead of my story. So the woman shows up at the well and she sees Jesus there, and she knows by the way he's dressed that he's Jewish. What's he doing here in Samaria? And Jesus said to her, woman, could you please get me some water from the well? And she's taken aback. Not only is he there, he's talking to me. He wants to drink from my water jug? And she said, sir, you're a Jew. I'm a Samaritan, and you're talking to me? You want me to give you water? And Jesus said, if you knew who I was, you would ask me, and I would give you living water. Because if you drink my living water, it will never run out. It'll bubble up living water within your soul and within your heart. And she looked at him and said, I'd like some of this living water, but you don't have a jar and the well's deep. How are you supposed to give me living water? And he said, well, I'll give you some. Go back to town and get your husband and come here. I don't have a husband, she said. Jesus looked right at her and said, yeah, you're telling the truth. You've had 5 husbands, but the man you're with right now is not your husband. You spoke truthfully. How did he know that? The woman was in shock. Jesus had just, right between the eyes, got her where she stood. He saw her and saw every sin she had committed? Who is this guy? And she shook herself from her startled surprise and said, sir, I can see that you're clearly a prophet. Quickly, she has to redirect, get him thinking about something else. And so she said, since you're a prophet, perhaps you can settle this age-old discussion that we have here in this town. See, You Jews say that we should worship in Jerusalem. We Samaritans feel we should worship on this mountain. Who's right? See, thinking if she brought up some big theological discussion, what this prophet would clearly be distracted and get that eye focus off of her sin. Jesus just looks at her and says, I tell you the truth. The time is coming and has now come when God is not looking for where you stand when you worship. He's looking for people who will worship him in spirit and in truth. She didn't know what to say. And so she said, well, I know that the Messiah is coming, the promised one, the Christ. And when he comes, he'll explain this all to us. Jesus just looks at her and says, the one who's speaking to you is the Messiah. Her eyes got about that big. And she just left her water jar right there and turned and ran into town as fast as she could. Now, as Jesus is talking to her, the disciples had come from town and they've got their food and stuff with them. And they see Jesus is talking to the Samaritan woman. And they're just like, what's going on? They didn't say anything. You could almost see it in their eyes, like, why are you talking to her? What's going on here? They didn't say anything. They're just looking like, what? And all of a sudden they saw her eyes get this big and she tears off into town, leaving her water jar behind. And they all look at each other like, yeah, that happened. But then no one wanted to say anything to Jesus about it. And so they're like, hey, we got you some food here. You want to eat? And Jesus just looks at them and says, yeah, I have food you don't know of. And they're like, did someone bring him something to eat? Did you bring him a sandwich? What's going on here? And Jesus just looks at his disciples and says, you guys look at the fields around and you say, I got good 4 months before we need to harvest. And Jesus said, but you don't understand. See, somebody sows all the seed and someone else comes to reap the harvest. The person who reaps the harvest, he didn't have to do all the hard work. It was done for him. He just comes and he harvests. And that's what I've done for you, Jesus said. But the harvest isn't in 4 months. The harvest it's ready now. The laborers are so few, but the harvest is right now. And Jesus looked at them because they're all kind of confused and they're still thinking, who brought him food, man? And Jesus said, my food is to do the work of the one who sent me. Now, while this is all going on, that lady had ran back into town and she grabbed all the men of town and she said, you got to listen to me. He's here. There's a guy at the well, a Jewish guy, and he told me every sin I ever committed. Surely this is the Messiah, the Christ. He's here. And the men of town were like, what? No, they knew the sins that she had committed because they knew her. But who is this guy? And they all came running out to the well because it wasn't that far away. And Jesus is just saying the harvest is plentiful. He's saying that looking over the disciples' shoulders, seeing this mob of people coming to him. And the disciples are still busy thinking, well, who gave him something to eat? And by that time, the mob reaches the well. And they're all like, hey, what's going on here? And they started asking Jesus questions, and he starts answering. And the disciples are just sitting there looking, going, you're talking to Samaritans. You know that, right? I mean, you're cool with this. And the more that the Samaritan men talk to Jesus, the more their eyes are getting open. And they turn and they look at the woman. They said, yeah, okay, we no longer believe because of what you said. We believe because of what we've seen and heard. And they said to Jesus, could you please stay with us and talk to us some more? And Jesus stayed in that Samaritan town, eating with them and talking with them for 2 whole days. And many people of the town believed. And they said, there's no doubt about it. This man, he's the one who's come to be the Savior of the world. Wow. It's a pretty big and important thing. And it all started with, well, I think Jesus is just tired, so he's going to sit by this well. But God had a much bigger plan, didn't he? Sometimes big, important, monumental moments, like an entire town believing that Jesus is the Messiah, start off with small, seemingly unimportant moments. Let's think about that a minute. Go back and listen to the story one more time, and then we'll go through some questions like we always do. Okay? Go back, listen to it one more time. I'll wait for you. Okay. Our first question we always ask is, what pleased you? What did you like about this story? Well, not everything in our story was wonderful, so what displeased you? What did you not like about this story? What does this story tell us about people? What people are like? Think about the woman who had done many not so great things in her life. Think about the people of the town, or the disciples who were kind of clueless as to what was going on. What does this story tell us about God? What God is like? Think about Jesus and how he dealt with the woman, and how he wasn't so worried about Samaritans and their icky dirtiness. So, what about this story touched you? What meant the most to you about this story? Important question too. What should I do differently because of this story? Now remember, this question needs to be answered, I should something. And lastly, who should I tell this story to? Now remember, it has to be a person and not someone who's just listening to the story with you. Put your answers down in the comments field below. I love to read those, and I hope you join me again next week for another episode of Children's Church.